So this car was running rough and the engine light came on, so I plugged in my OBD2 scanner and found it has a code, trouble code called P0303, misfire cylinder number 3. So what's a misfire? Misfire is when the cylinder is just not contributing to the power of the engine. It's not burning gas in that cylinder. And generally misfire can be caused by 3 things. You can see my notes here. 3 things: lack of spark to the combustion chamber, lack of compression to the cylinder or inside the cylinder, or a lack of fuel being delivered to the cylinder. Now this is an injection engine. Most engines are these days. In fact, you probably wouldn't even have an OBD connection if you didn't have a fuel injected engine. So that's what I'm assuming, is that you have a fuel injected engine. So my first step when I have almost anything, but especially in this case, I have the trouble code on cylinder number 3. Well, I need to look up where is cylinder number 3. So I Googled it, and if we go back to Google, I Googled for a Ford 1.6 cylinder firing order, and the firing order here says is 1342, but the important thing is it shows me a picture of where the cylinders are. So the engine sits in the car like this, and it's showing me cylinder number 3 is right there. So I'm doing a visual inspection. Here's the injector. Make sure the injector's plugged in okay. Here's the spark plug wire. It's plugged into the coil. Looks okay. Look for is the coil disconnected at all? I doubt it. Coil has got all four spark plug wires on it. So visually everything looks okay. So what's the next step? Well, I gotta check my notes. The next step, I think, is to remove the spark plug. Probably, I'm thinking. The spark plugs wear out, so it certainly could be a worn out spark plug, or it could be several other things. So let's go back to my notes. Sorry, this tablet's kind of slow. Okay, I want to mention that the firing order, I looked that up just so I'd get the diagram. The firing order itself I don't really care about in the case of a misfire. I know there's something wrong in that cylinder, and so I'm looking around here for problems. Now, of course, how does the engine work? Well, it puts air and gas in the cylinder, and the cylinder gets a spark at the right time, and it burns that gas and causes the piston to go down, and that's power to the engine. So those are all the things that have to work right. You have to get air in through the air cleaner, and all the other cylinders are getting air. They're all working fine, in fact. So I know it's not a problem over here. I know it's localized in this case to cylinder number 3, because that's the only misfire code I got. How does the computer know it's misfiring on cylinder number 3, you might ask? Well, it actually uses that firing order, and it looks at the RPM. It gets RPM information from the crankshaft sensor, which I forgot where it is on this car, but it's somewhere down by the crankshaft, and it sees that the engine is slowing down right when cylinder number 3 is supposed to fire. It's in the firing order, but the engine slows down rather than speeding up. So that's how it identifies cylinder number 3 has a misfire, because it constantly sees the engine slowing down when it gets to firing number 3. Okay, so that's how we know it's number 3. So the easiest thing to check is the spark plug. So now in some cases you might have the coil, you might have separate coils for every plug, and so there would be a coil I have to remove here, usually with an 8 or a 10 millimeter bolt holding it in. And I would take the coil, I would unplug the coil probably, take it off, and then I would take this wire off. Okay, and you can inspect the wire, make sure it's good. Then you would take the spark plug out and inspect the spark plug. Well, I already did that actually, and here's the spark plug. This one looks fine. If yours doesn't look this good, take a picture of it or look at it carefully, and maybe look online if it looks suspicious. Look online for, what does the spark plug look like that's misfiring. It could be oily, it could be wet from fuel getting on it but not burning. It could be rusty from water getting in the cylinder from say a busted head gasket. Oil can get in through the valve guides or again through the head gasket. So those are all things that can mess up the spark plug, or it can just wear out. So if it was, I can't get a good shot of it with this camera, but if it was worn out, it would have a smaller nub on it. It would, the tang, the electrode there would be worn down, and I would just replace them all. But I did that last year on this car, or maybe 2 years ago, so I know they're all good. But for you, that's what I would inspect first, is the spark plug. If it looks good, then the next thing I would do is to test the ignition itself to make sure I'm getting a spark from the coil and it's going through this wire and it's coming to this plug. So what I would do is I would put this plug back in to the spark plug wire like that, and then I would connect it. I would try to get a ground on it like this. So this fuel rail here is grounded. I would hold it on there, but I wouldn't hold it with my hand because I'm probably going to get shocked if I do. So maybe I would get an insulated screwdriver, or maybe a big rag like this. This might protect me, and just hold it on there like that. Like that, and then I would have someone go and crank the engine about 1 or 2 rotations only to see if a spark shows up in that gap where it should. And if it doesn't, then I could have, I know that it's an ignition problem, because it's either the spark plug or the wire or the coil itself. Could be the computer too, but I know the computer is throwing sparks to all the other plugs, so I'm going to suspect it's more localized to cylinder number 3 here, not the coil. But if I had individual coils, the next thing I would do is I would actually, if I didn't get a spark, I would actually maybe swap the coil and try plugging in a different coil and doing the same test again. And if I got a spark from a different coil, then I would just replace that coil that was bad, and that would be the end of it. But if it's not the coil, the other thing I could try is I could get another plug. If this plug wasn't sparking, maybe it's the plug, and especially if it looks old. But I'm going to probably change them all, but I kind of want to know what the diagnosis is, so I'm going to put another plug in there and run that test again. Oh, and by the way, the engine might start when the helper goes and cranks it for you. you want him, warn him to turn it off right away if it does that, because you don't want to run the engine with a spark plug out, because it'll huff and puff really bad through that cylinder if the engine's running with a hole, you know, in the cylinder. But so that's a way to test the spark plug. And then the last thing would be, on ignition wise, would just to be to make sure it's not, you're not having a problem with this particular outlet of the coil. So you know these other three are working for sure. So what you can do is, say, unplug this spark plug from here and pull, say, number 4 out here, and put your spark plug in number 4 and try it again. And if it wasn't working before and suddenly it's working when you're connected to wire number 4, then I would say you have a problem with either the wire or the coil itself. And in that case, I guess I would change the wire first. And if that didn't work, I would, put a new wire in, or maybe swap 2 wires around if they will reach. I don't know if they'll reach in this case, because these wires are, each one is longer as you go forward on the engine. But you can swap out the wire just to test, see if it's bad, or you can, or eventually, if you narrow it down to the coil, you can replace the coil. Those are more expensive, but sometimes they do go bad in that way. I have had that happen on other cars. So those are all the tests you can run on the ignition, and if the ignition turns out to be okay, you still have a misfire. The next thing I would check is the compression. So you have to have a compression gauge for that. If you don't have one, you can borrow one. This is mine. It's a gauge with a hose on it, and the end of it screws in to the spark plug hole. And you make sure you get the right threads on, and then you spin it on until you feel that O-ring tighten down inside in that hole. Don't over tighten it, it just needs to seal a little bit. And then again, you can have a helper crank over the engine, or you can crank it yourself, because usually these compression testers will hold the last setting that they received. So if I crank this right now myself, make sure the engine doesn't start, or if it does, I stop it right away. And then I come back and check this dial, and it's probably going to be around somewhere between 150 and 180, because I know this engine's good and the cylinder is good, because it was working fine until I unplugged it. I just did that to show you what things look like on the scanner and so forth. But yeah, I would run the compression test. If the compression is way down, say between 90 or 100 and 120, that tells me I've got a problem. I've either got a bad valve that's burned or somehow leaking, maybe it's bent, I don't know, or I've got a bad head gasket, or I don't know if a manifold gasket would cause that or not. But really what I'm going to have to do in the case of low compression is I'm going to have to take the whole head off of the car. The cylinder head has to come off, and the valves have to be observed and checked, and the leak has to be found. And it could be the head gasket. I would look at the gasket very carefully when I take the head off to make sure I don't disturb the evidence in the process of removing the head. But I look very carefully for a leak in the gasket, and then I look at the valves very carefully. And I could do a leak down test at this point, actually. I might do that, probably would do that, but that takes another piece of equipment, which I do have, but I'm not going to run the test right now. Just know that if you find a cylinder with low compression, you can run a leak down test to see if you can determine, because with a leak down test you're blowing air into the cylinder, and you're listening for where that air comes out. If it comes out, say the tailpipe, and you hear a hissing in the tailpipe while you're putting air in the cylinder, then you know probably the exhaust valve is open, and maybe it's leaking. But you'd have to say turn the engine to top dead center for cylinder number 3 to know that it's trying to close the valve, and if you hear a leak when the valve is closed, or in fact the leak could also be here in the intake manifold if the intake valve is bent or burned. Usually it's exhaust valves that burn and intake valves that bend. Any of those conditions, you have to remove the cylinder head and repair the valves, replace the valves, whatever it takes to get it back in serviceable condition. So that's the second possible cause of a misfire. The third possible cause is a lack of fuel. And if this injector is not firing properly and not getting fuel into the cylinder, that will cause a misfire. So what I do when I've narrowed it down to that point, I get to a little bit harder task, and that is removing this fuel rail. There are 2 bolts. You can see there's one down there, I think it's 10 millimeters. Another one over here. You have to move the wiring harness out of the way, and then I would leave the harness connected, and I would pull the rail up slowly. It's got O-rings in all of the injectors. You're pulling the whole set of injectors up. I'm going to have to move this PCV hose first, and then I would pull this up. I'm not going to do it today. I'm just telling you how I would do it on this car. Your car is going to be different. But pull the full fuel rail up, try to leave it connected to everything, and then hold it up while somebody, a helper again, cranks the engine. Now you're going to be watching gas shoot out of all of these injectors, and don't let him crank it very long, because you don't want to get a bunch of gas in here that could catch fire. So this is kind of a dangerous part. The caution is, and you can put a rag underneath so that the gas goes onto a rag, but you're watching the injectors carefully while the engine cranks, and it's trying to start, but it doesn't have any gas because all the gas is squirting out on the top of the engine. But the point is, you're looking carefully at the injectors to see if that number 3 is squirting the same as the other 3. And if it's not, then you know how you have a problem with the injector. Now, if it's squirting a little bit but not the right amount, it could just be dirty. But then you know it's either got to be cleaned or replaced. If it's not squirting at all, the next thing I do is I swap 2 injectors, and then I do the same test again. And if the problem moves to the swapped injector, then I know that injector wasn't working, because it's still not working in the new position. But and if that happens, that also tells me, if this injector is now working and this one's not, then I know that that injector was bad. And oh, by the way, the wiring to this injector is good. So that's a way to narrow it down between the part itself and the wiring. And if the wiring's bad, you're not going to get anything out of that injector, no matter which injector you plug in. And then you have to cut all of this away and trace the wire, or look, one wire goes to power and one wire goes to the computer that gets the signal that opens the injector. Those are the 2 wires that you're going to have to trace down and find out. It's possible it's the computer, but more likely it's the wire that's causing the problem. So those are the things to check. And I think I've covered all of my notes, but I will post the notes in the description so you can read the notes and everything I said basically. And I'll also put a link in there to a page that I have about misfires, and you can see a picture there of what the spark looks like when it's sparking during the spark test and so on. You can read more details. Thanks for watching. Enjoy your day.